more insight on the plan and its potential impact, we're joined by Edward Cameron, Managing Director of BSR, Business for Social Responsibility. David, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
So as we mentioned, China recently submitted its 16-page plan. Anything in there that surprised you?
I think the biggest surprise for people who aren't accustomed to this sort of announcement is the level of ambition contained within the Chinese proposal and what that means in terms of changes to the global economy. The measures that you've just outlined in your introduction represent an unprecedented structural change in the Chinese economy, which will have knock-on signals to the rest of the economy. For example, it sends a signal to investors that a new dawn is emerging for investments in renewable energy, in energy efficiency, in the way in which goods and services are manufactured in China, all of which presents an opportunity for investors. It sends signals to major corporations who have operations and supply chains in China that a new low greenhouse gas world is emerging within that country that they will need to respond to. It sends a message to other countries that it is possible to reconcile economic growth on the scale required by China simply to keep pace with employment generation with green development.
It sends this message, it sends the signal, but it's yet to be implemented. We still don't know how feasible this is, how, yes, the plan is very ambitious, but can that goal be realistically met?
I believe it can be for two reasons. First of all, if you look at China's track record on these issues, they have a habit of being able to implement what they commit to, and they don't typically commit to things when they don't have full confidence that they can meet the target. The second thing is that China has deployed a whole series of incentives, political and otherwise, to try and meet these goals in terms of, for example, putting in place the right provincial policies, but also in terms of mobilizing the scale of finance that will be necessary to bring these policies to fruition.
Well,
so
China
I have
says
confidence.
it'll cost about $6.6 trillion. That's the price tag for this. How do we get there?
I think we get there through a blend of public finance and through a blend of private finance. I think one of the things that the Chinese government will do well to follow is the need to engage in a partnership, a collaboration, if you will, with the private sector. So I think it's going to be very, very important to mobilize state-owned enterprises, indigenously owned private enterprises, but also multinationals that have vast supply chains in China that can incentivize those supply chains to lower greenhouse gas emissions. But on top of that, about 19% of Chinese GDP is public procurement. So even with the purchasing power of the Chinese state, there are many financial incentives that can be used.
This very ambitious goal comes at a time where China's economy is undergoing a growth slowdown. Premier Li Keqiang has previously declared a war on pollution, but at the same time, he's vowing to keep the economy strong at least 7%. Are these goals reconcilable? Can you maintain this level of growth at the same time restructuring the nature of your economy, shifting it to a more consumer-driven one, and at the same time taking away carbon emissions, fossil fuels, keeping in mind that China's coal use is about 66% of its energy? Can this all happen at the same time?
I believe it can. You mentioned at the very outset the notion of co-benefits and the fact that the Chinese government are very concerned about public health issues. And so one of the motivating factors behind this measure is to tackle those issues of public health, airborne pollution, the hundreds of thousands of premature deaths that happen in China every year as a result of air pollution. On top of that, we have to consider the cost of climate impacts that are already having an effect in China and will over the longer term. On top of that, the economic benefits of what is essentially a substantial, as you mentioned, $6 trillion stimulus to the economy is of very large orders of magnitude.
One of the things that I find interesting is the concept of developing a national cap and trade system. China has basically saying that it's going to have a system where companies will pay for permits to pollute and then they can trade them and buy and sell them amongst each other. How do you see that lifting off?
Well, it's already lifted off. There are 7 pilot projects in emissions trading systems at the provincial level in China already, which already constitutes the second largest emissions trading system in the world after the European Union. And the Chinese plan unveiled last week is to bring those pilot projects together under a national plan by the end of next year. So they've already gone through an incubation period at the provincial level over the course of the last number of years, which they will now bring together at the end of next year. And that, again, will be another important signal to the market. The signal being that if you reduce your emissions and if you collect the surplus permits, you can trade them on an open market and bring investment back into your companies.
Let's talk about some of the other investment opportunities that this decarbonization movement is bringing to China.
Well, for example, I want to hone in again on this notion of $6 trillion. If you look at that in terms of order of magnitude, that is the equivalent of the Marshall Plan that was deployed in Europe after the Second World War to rebuild the European economy in the European continent. That buys you an awful lot of jobs that are highly skilled jobs and well-paying jobs. It also avoids the worst impacts of climate change if it's taken into consideration with broader international collective action. Those impacts alone would have devastating consequences for water, for food security, for public health within China as well. So the stimulus that will go into the Chinese economy, coupled with the avoided impacts of climate change, will have very, very substantial knock-on effects for the Chinese economy.
All right. Thank you so much, Edward Cameron. We're going to have to leave it there. Edward Cameron, Managing Director of BSR.